The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Phoenix as soldiers prepared for another routine patrol. Among them moved a figure that had become both familiar and mysterious to the men of Bravo Company. She was known simply as Tent Girl, a nickname that stuck after she arrived 3 weeks ago and immediately claimed the smallest, most isolated tent at the edge of their forward operating base. Private Sarah Chen kept her head down as she checked her gear for the third time that morning. The other soldiers had grown accustomed to her quiet presence, though few bothered to learn her real name. To them, she was just another support personnel, probably a supply clerk or communications specialist who somehow ended up assigned to their infantry unit in the mountains of Afghanistan. "Hey, Tent Girl," called out Sergeant Martinez as he adjusted his body armor. "You staying back at base today or coming out with us again?" Sarah looked up briefly, her dark eyes reflecting a calmness that seemed unusual for someone so young. At 23, she appeared even younger, with her slight frame often lost in the oversized military fatigues that never seemed to fit quite right. She nodded silently, shouldering her pack with practiced efficiency. The soldiers had noticed she always volunteered for the most dangerous patrols, though they couldn't figure out why. Some speculated she was trying to prove herself. Others thought she was just eager to get out of camp duties. What they didn't notice was the way her eyes constantly scanned for potential injury risks, how she positioned herself strategically during movements, or the specialized medical supplies carefully hidden throughout her gear. Corporal Jackson, a veteran of 2 previous deployments, watched her with growing curiosity. Unlike the others, he had begun to notice small details that didn't add up. The way she moved with purpose rather than uncertainty, how she never seemed rattled by incoming fire. The fact that she carried significantly more weight in her pack than anyone else, yet never complained or fell behind during long marches. "Something about that girl doesn't sit right with me," Jackson confided to his battle buddy, Private Williams, as they loaded into the convoy vehicles. "She's too calm, too prepared. Like she knows something we don't." Williams shrugged, more focused on the mission ahead. "Maybe she's just good at hiding how scared she is." We all cope differently, but Jackson wasn't convinced. He had seen enough new soldiers to recognize the signs of fear, inexperience, or overcompensation. Sarah displayed none of these. Instead, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen action before, though her personnel file showed this was her first deployment. As the convoy rolled out through the base gates, Sarah positioned herself in the vehicle where she could see all the other soldiers, while maintaining a clear view of the route ahead. Her hands rested casually on her pack, but her fingers knew the exact location of every piece of medical equipment inside. The quick clot bandages, the emergency airways, the morphine auto-injectors, all carefully organized for rapid access in complete darkness if necessary. The mission was supposed to be routine, a presence patrol through 3 villages in their area of operations, followed by a meeting with local tribal leaders about a new irrigation project. Intelligence reports indicated minimal threat levels, with no recent insurgent activity in the region. It was the kind of patrol that seasoned soldiers sometimes found more dangerous than obvious combat missions, simply because the lack of apparent threat could lead to complacency. Sarah knew better. During her extensive medical training, she had learned that most casualties occurred during supposedly routine operations. Equipment failures, vehicle accidents, surprise attacks, friendly fire incidents. The chaos of war had countless ways to create medical emergencies when least expected. As they approached the first village, she quietly checked her gear once more. The other soldiers were relaxed, joking about weekend plans back home and complaining about the heat. But Sarah's trained eye caught subtle signs they missed: the unusual absence of children playing in the streets, the way some villagers avoided eye contact, the positioning of certain objects that could conceal improvised explosive devices. She wanted to say something, to warn them, but she had learned to keep her observations to herself. The soldiers already saw her as an outsider, and questioning their tactical awareness would only make things worse. Instead, she prepared herself mentally for what might come, running through trauma protocols and emergency procedures that had been drilled into her during months of intensive training. The convoy stopped at the village center, and the soldiers dismounted with routine efficiency. Sarah stayed close to Sergeant Martinez, the patrol leader, knowing that command elements were often primary targets in ambush scenarios. Her position allowed her to reach any wounded soldier quickly while maintaining cover behind the vehicles. Local villagers began to emerge from their homes, some approaching with the cautious friendliness that had developed over months of regular patrols. Children started to appear, drawn by the soldiers' presence and the possibility of receiving candy or small gifts. The tension that Sarah had sensed earlier seemed to dissipate as normal village life resumed around them. But she remained alert, her eyes constantly moving, assessing angles of fire, identifying cover positions, and noting the location of each soldier. The medical bag on her hip felt heavier than usual, weighted with the responsibility she carried but couldn't openly acknowledge. Private Rodriguez approached a group of children near a mud brick wall, pulling wrapped candies from his pocket. The scene looked peaceful, even heartwarming. A young American soldier sharing treats with Afghan children while their parents watched with cautious smiles. It was exactly the kind of moment that military photographers loved to capture, showing the human side of their mission. Sarah watched Rodriguez with growing unease. Something about the wall behind him bothered her, though she couldn't immediately identify what. The construction looked normal, the children seemed genuinely happy, and the parents maintained appropriate distance while keeping protective eyes on their offspring. Yet her instincts, honed through countless hours of combat medical training, screamed that something was wrong. She began moving closer to Rodriguez's position, her movements casual enough not to draw attention, but purposeful enough to get her within rapid response range. The other soldiers were spread throughout the village square, conducting their own interactions with locals or maintaining security positions. They were professional and alert, but none of them seemed to sense the danger that Sarah felt, building like an approaching storm. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as the patrol continued its routine mission, unaware that in less than an hour, their quiet tent girl would reveal skills that would save multiple lives and forever change how they saw the unassuming young woman who had been hiding in plain sight among them. The explosion shattered the peaceful afternoon like thunder from a clear sky. One moment, Private Rodriguez was laughing with the Afghan children as they eagerly grabbed for candy, and the next, the world erupted in a violent cloud of dust, debris, and screaming voices. The improvised explosive device had been buried beneath the seemingly innocent mud brick wall, triggered by pressure when Rodriguez stepped too close. The blast threw Rodriguez 15 feet across the village square, his body crumpling against a stone wall with a sickening impact. Shrapnel from the explosion peppered 3 other soldiers who had been providing security nearby, while the Afghan children scattered in terror, some bleeding from cuts caused by flying fragments of brick and metal. In the chaos that followed, most soldiers hit the ground and began scanning for additional threats, their training kicking in as they established a defensive perimeter. Radio calls crackled frantically as Sergeant Martinez attempted to report the incident and request immediate medical evacuation. The peaceful village scene had transformed into a nightmare of smoke, dust, and confusion. But while others reacted with shock and defensive protocols, Sarah moved with startling purpose and clarity. She sprinted toward Rodriguez's motionless form, her medical bag already open and supplies in hand before she reached him. Her transformation was immediate and complete. Gone was the quiet, almost invisible support person the soldiers had grown accustomed to. In her place was a highly trained combat medic operating with precision and confidence. "Rodriguez is down," she called out, her voice carrying an authority that none of the soldiers had heard from her before. She dropped to her knees beside the unconscious private, her hands already assessing his injuries with practiced efficiency. Multiple lacerations covered his face and arms, blood soaked through his uniform in several places, and his left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. Working with remarkable speed, Sarah began addressing the most life-threatening injuries first. She applied pressure to a severing artery in Rodriguez's thigh, while simultaneously checking his airway for obstructions. Her movements were fluid and confident, displaying a level of medical knowledge that went far beyond basic first aid training. Corporal Jackson, who had been thrown to the ground by the blast but escaped serious injury, watched in amazement as Sarah worked. "Where the hell did she learn to do that?" he shouted to Williams over the ringing in his ears caused by the explosion. Sarah ignored the questions and commentary around her, completely focused on keeping Rodriguez alive. She quickly established an IV line to combat shock, administered pain medication, and began splinting his obviously broken leg using materials from her surprisingly well-stocked medical kit. Her hands never shook, never hesitated, moving with the confidence of someone who had performed these procedures countless times under similar circumstances. "I need 2 more soldiers over here now," she commanded, pointing to Privates Johnson and Thompson. "Johnson, maintain pressure on this wound exactly where my hand is. Thompson, keep his head elevated and monitor his breathing. If his breathing becomes shallow or irregular, call out immediately." The authority in her voice was so compelling that both soldiers obeyed without question, despite the fact that she held the same rank as they did. There was something in her demeanor that spoke of experience and expertise that transcended military hierarchy. While continuing to work on Rodriguez, Sarah simultaneously directed attention to the other wounded soldiers. "Martinez, Corporal Davis has shrapnel in his shoulder and needs immediate attention. Williams, check on those children. Some of them are bleeding and may need treatment." "Sergeant." Martinez found himself following her directions despite his confusion about how a support clerk had suddenly become their medical authority. Davis was indeed wounded, though he had been trying to tough it out and continue his security duties. Blood seeped through his uniform sleeve, and his face had grown pale from blood loss. Sarah's assessment proved accurate when Davis collapsed moments later, his body going into shock from the untreated wound. She had anticipated this outcome, and had already prepared supplies for his treatment, directing Martinez through the steps needed to stabilize him while she continued working on the more critically injured. Rodriguez. The Afghan children, who had been caught in the blast, presented another challenge. Several had cuts and one young boy appeared to have a concussion from being thrown against a wall. Sarah somehow managed to coordinate their care as well, instructing Williams and Johnson on basic wound cleaning and bandaging techniques, while never losing focus on her primary patients. "How is she doing all this?" Williams muttered to Jackson as they followed Sarah's clear, precise instructions for treating the wounded boy. "She's like a completely different person." Indeed, Sarah's transformation was remarkable. The quiet, almost invisible soldier they had known for weeks had been replaced by a confident medical professional who seemed to have eyes in the back of her head and hands that could perform multiple complex tasks simultaneously. She moved between patients with efficiency, prioritizing treatments based on severity of injuries and likelihood of survival. 20 minutes after the explosion, the sound of approaching helicopters indicated that the medical evacuation team was arriving. But thanks to Sarah's immediate and expert intervention, all the wounded were stable, and their conditions were no longer life-threatening. Rodriguez, who might have bled to death in the first few minutes after the blast, was conscious and talking. Davis's bleeding had been controlled, and the Afghan children were being comforted by their parents while receiving appropriate medical care. As the medevac team landed and began loading the wounded onto stretchers, the flight medic paused to speak with Sarah. "Outstanding work out here," he said, reviewing her treatment notes with obvious approval. "Your assessment and stabilization procedures probably saved at least 2 lives today. Where did you train?" The question hung in the air as the other soldiers gathered around, suddenly realizing they knew almost nothing about the young woman who had just demonstrated extraordinary medical skills under combat conditions. Sarah looked uncomfortable with the attention, deflecting the medic's question with a modest shrug. "Just basic training," she said quietly, beginning to pack up her medical supplies with the same methodical efficiency she had displayed during the emergency. But Corporal Jackson wasn't buying it. He had seen plenty of soldiers with basic medical training, and what Sarah had just accomplished went far beyond anything taught in standard military first aid courses. Her knowledge of trauma medicine, her ability to perform complex procedures under pressure, and her natural leadership during the crisis all pointed to extensive specialized training. As the helicopters departed with the wounded, carrying them to better medical facilities, the remaining soldiers looked at Sarah with new eyes. The quiet tent girl who had been almost invisible among them had revealed capabilities that none of them possessed. Questions began forming in their minds about who she really was and why someone with her obvious skills was assigned to an infantry unit as apparent support personnel. The afternoon sun continued to beat down on the village, but the dynamic within Bravo Company had shifted permanently. Sarah Chen was no longer just the mysterious girl who kept to herself in the corner tent. She was someone with secrets, someone whose presence among them might not be as random as they had assumed. The questions started the moment they returned to Camp Phoenix. As the convoy rolled through the base gates, Corporal Jackson could contain his curiosity no longer. He cornered Sarah near the vehicle maintenance area as she was unloading her gear, her medical bag noticeably lighter after using supplies to save Rodriguez and the others. "All right, Chen," Jackson said, using her real name for the first time since she had arrived at the base. That was no basic first aid back there. "I've seen combat medics with years of experience who couldn't have handled that situation as well as you did. So what's your real story?" Sarah avoided his eyes, focusing on securing her equipment with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. "I don't know what you mean." "I just did what anyone would have done." "Bullshit," Jackson replied bluntly. "Anyone else would have panicked or made mistakes that could have gotten people killed. You performed like you've been treating combat casualties for years. Your IV technique, the way you prioritized injuries, how you directed multiple treatments simultaneously. That's advanced trauma medicine." Other soldiers began gathering around them, drawn by Jackson's raised voice and their own burning curiosity about what they had witnessed. Private Williams, Thompson, and Johnson had all followed Sarah's medical directions during the crisis, and they too had questions about her background and training. Sarah felt the weight of their stares and expectations. For weeks, she had successfully maintained her cover as a support clerk who happened to volunteer for patrols. The anonymity had been comfortable, allowing her to observe and assess the unit's medical preparedness without drawing attention to her specialized skills. But the IED attack had forced her to reveal capabilities that couldn't be easily explained away. "Look," she said finally, "I had some additional medical training before this deployment. That's all." "What kind of additional training?" pressed Sergeant Martinez, who had been listening from nearby. As the patrol leader, he was responsible for knowing the capabilities of every soldier under his command, and Sarah's performance had caught him completely off guard. Before Sarah could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Sergeant Rodriguez, no relation to the wounded private, who served as the company's senior non-commissioned officer. His presence immediately shifted the dynamic, causing the gathered soldiers to straighten up and adopt more formal postures. "Chen, the CO wants to see you in his office immediately," Rodriguez announced. "Something about your performance during today's incident." Sarah nodded, shouldering her gear and following the master sergeant toward the command tent. The other soldiers watched her go, their questions multiplying rather than diminishing. Why would the company commander want to speak with a support clerk about medical procedures? What was really in her personnel file that they hadn't been told? Captain Morrison's command tent was larger than the others but still cramped, filled with maps, communication equipment, and stacks of operational reports. The captain himself was a serious man in his early 30s, a West Point graduate who had earned his soldiers' respect through competent leadership and genuine concern for their welfare. "Have a seat, Private Chen," Morrison said, gesturing to a folding chair across from his desk. "I've been getting some interesting reports about today's incident." Sarah sat down carefully, maintaining the same neutral expression she had worn throughout her time with the unit. She had expected this conversation would eventually come, though she had hoped to maintain her cover for longer. "The medevac team was very impressed with your work," Morrison continued, consulting a sheet of paper that contained notes from his radio conversation with the flight medic. "They said your treatment protocols and documentation were at the level of a seasoned combat medic. Care to explain how a supply clerk acquired those skills?" The direct question hung in the air between them. Sarah realized that evasion was no longer possible, but she also knew there were limits to what she could reveal without authorization from higher command levels. "Sir, I have additional medical training beyond what's listed in my standard personnel file," she said carefully. "I'm qualified to provide advanced trauma care when situations require it." Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with increased interest. "What kind of additional training and why isn't it in your file?" Sarah hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Sir, I believe those questions should be directed to higher headquarters. My orders were to integrate with this unit as support personnel and assist where needed." The captain's eyebrows rose. "Your orders came from higher headquarters? Not through normal personnel channels?" Before Sarah could respond, Morrison's radio crackled with an incoming message. The voice on the other end was clear and authoritative. "Phoenix Base, this is Colonel Mitchell. I need to speak with Private Chen immediately." Morrison looked surprised. Colonel Mitchell was the regimental commander, operating from the main base 30 miles away. For him to be calling about a private was highly unusual, especially one who was supposedly just a support clerk. "Chen, you're on," Morrison said, handing her the radio handset while trying to make sense of this unexpected development. Sarah took the radio with steady hands. "This is Private Chen, sir. Chen, I've been monitoring reports from today's incident." The colonel's voice came through clearly. "Outstanding work out there. How are you holding up?" "Fine, sir. All wounded personnel were successfully evacuated and are expected to make full recoveries." "Good. I need you to report to main base tomorrow morning for a debriefing. A helicopter will pick you up at 800 hours. The radio exchange was brief and professional, but it left Captain Morrison with even more questions. Why would a regimental commander personally track the performance of an individual private? And why was she being summoned for a private debriefing, rather than submitting a standard after-action report through normal channels? After signing off, Sarah handed the radio back to Morrison, who was studying her with undisguised curiosity. "Private Chen," he said slowly, "I'm starting to think there's a lot about your assignment to my unit that I wasn't told. Care to enlighten me?" Sarah maintained her neutral expression. "Sir, I believe the colonel will provide any necessary information during tomorrow's debriefing." Morrison nodded, recognizing that he wasn't going to get more details from her directly. "Dismissed, Private. But Chen, good work today. Whatever your background, you saved lives out there." As Sarah left the command tent, she found several soldiers waiting outside, obviously hoping to overhear some explanation for her mysterious skills and high-level attention. Their curiosity was understandable but posed a problem for maintaining operational security. Jackson stepped forward as she emerged. "So, what did the captain want?" "Just a standard debriefing about the medical procedures," Sarah replied, aware that the answer would satisfy no one, but unable to provide more details. As she walked toward her isolated tent, Sarah could feel the weight of their stares and hear the murmur of speculation that followed in her wake. Her cover was blown, at least partially, and tomorrow's meeting with Colonel Mitchell would likely bring changes to her assignment. The comfortable anonymity she had maintained for weeks was gone, replaced by awkward attention and dangerous curiosity. Inside her tent, Sarah sat on her narrow cot and reviewed the day's events. The successful treatment of the wounded soldiers felt good. It was why she had trained so extensively and why she had volunteered for this assignment. But the exposure of her capabilities complicated everything. The other soldiers would be watching her differently now, asking questions she couldn't answer, and expecting explanations she wasn't authorized to provide. She opened her personal kit and pulled out a small, encrypted communication device that the other soldiers had never seen. Tomorrow's meeting with the colonel would determine whether her mission with Bravo Company could continue, or whether her cover had been too badly compromised to maintain. Either way, the quiet days of being just tent girl were over. The helicopter arrived at Camp Phoenix precisely at 800 hours, its rotor wash kicking up clouds of dust that sent soldiers scrambling to secure loose equipment. Sarah walked toward the aircraft with her standard gear, knowing that the eyes of every soldier in Bravo Company were watching her departure. The mystery surrounding her had only deepened overnight, with speculation running wild through the barracks about her true identity and mission. Corporal Jackson watched from the maintenance tent as Sarah climbed aboard the Black Hawk. "I'm telling you, Williams," he said to his battle buddy, "she's not who she pretends to be. Support clerks don't get personal helicopter rides to meet with colonels. The flight to the main base took 40 minutes over rugged mountain terrain that reminded Sarah why Afghanistan was called the graveyard of empires. From the air, she could see the scattered villages and ancient trade routes that had witnessed countless conflicts throughout history. Her own small role in this vast military operation felt both significant and insignificant at the same time. Colonel Mitchell's office was located in a permanent building rather than a tent, reflecting the more established nature of the main base. The colonel himself was a career officer in his late 40s, with graying hair and the weathered appearance of someone who had spent considerable time in combat zones. His reputation was that of a pragmatic leader who cared more about results than appearances. "Private Chen, please have a seat," Mitchell said as she entered his office. Unlike Captain Morrison's cramped tent, this space was spacious and well organized, with maps covering one wall and commendation photos lining another. "First, let me say that your performance yesterday was exactly what we hoped for when we arranged your assignment to Bravo Company." Sarah remained at attention, Thank you, sir. At ease, Private. We need to have a frank discussion about your mission and what happens next. Mitchell consulted a classified folder on his desk. Your real assignment with Bravo Company wasn't as a support clerk, was it? No, sir, Sarah replied, relaxing slightly but remaining alert. Mitchell nodded. For the record, Private Chen is a graduate of the Army's Special Operations Combat Medic Course and the Advanced Trauma Life Support Program. She's also completed specialized training in battlefield medicine and tactical emergency care that only a handful of medics receive each year. The colonel paused to let this information settle. She was assigned to Bravo Company as part of a pilot program to embed highly trained medical specialists in infantry units without revealing their specialized capabilities. The goal was to assess how having immediate access to advanced trauma care might affect casualty rates and mission effectiveness. Sarah had known this conversation would eventually come, but hearing her mission described so matter-of-factly still felt strange. For months she had lived a double life, pretending to be something she wasn't while preparing for moments like yesterday's IED attack. The program has been controversial, Mitchell continued. Some argue that placing medics in regular infantry units without proper identification violates medical neutrality protocols. Others contend that the tactical advantages outweigh the concerns. Yesterday's incident provided the first real-world test of the concept. How did I do, sir? Sarah asked. Outstanding. The after-action reports from the medevac team, Captain Morrison, and even the Afghan medical personnel who treated the injured children all praise your performance. You saved multiple lives through immediate, expert intervention that wouldn't have been available otherwise. Mitchell stood and walked to the wall map showing their area of operations. But your success created a new problem. The soldiers in Bravo Company are now asking questions that compromise your cover. Captain Morrison suspects you're more than a support clerk, and some of the enlisted personnel are openly speculating about your background. Sarah had anticipated this issue. What are my options, sir? 3 possibilities, Mitchell replied. First, we could transfer you to another unit and try to maintain the experimental program elsewhere. Second, we could reveal your true role to Bravo Company and continue the mission with full disclosure. Third, we could extract you entirely and evaluate the program based on data collected so far. Each option presented challenges. A transfer would mean abandoning the relationships and trust she had begun building with Bravo Company, while full disclosure might change how the soldiers interacted with her and affect the validity of the experimental data. Extraction would end her field assignment just as she was beginning to make a real difference. What's your recommendation, sir? Sarah asked. Before Mitchell could respond, his aide knocked on the door and entered with an urgent message. Sir, we've received a priority communication about Bravo Company. They're being deployed on a special operation tomorrow that intelligence indicates could result in significant casualties. Mitchell read the message quickly, his expression growing serious. The timing of this couldn't be worse, he muttered. Or better, depending on how you look at it. He turned back to Sarah. There's been a development that changes everything. Intelligence has located a high-value target in a compound about 20 miles from Camp Phoenix. The mission to capture or eliminate this target will involve Bravo Company and 2 other units in a coordinated assault. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What kind of casualties are anticipated? The target is a bomb maker responsible for IEDs throughout the region. His compound is heavily fortified and defended by experienced fighters. We're expecting significant resistance and the possibility of multiple wounded personnel. Mitchell walked back to his desk and consulted another classified document. Under normal circumstances, the assault would include a dedicated medical team. But the terrain and tactical situation make it impossible to position traditional medical support close enough to be effective during the initial assault phase. The implications were clear to Sarah. You want me to continue with Bravo Company for this mission? I'm asking if you're willing to. The soldiers know you have medical skills now, but they don't know the extent of your training or your real assignment. You could participate in this operation as their unofficial medic, while we decide how to handle the larger program issues afterward. Sarah considered the request carefully. The mission sounded extremely dangerous, with the potential for exactly the kind of mass casualty situations her training had prepared her for, but it also meant continuing to operate under partial cover, maintaining some deceptions while revealing others. What would I tell Captain Morrison and the soldiers about my background? As little as possible, Mitchell replied. You can acknowledge having additional medical training without revealing the experimental program or your specialized qualifications. Let them think you're a medic who was initially assigned support duties for administrative reasons. The explanation would satisfy some curiosity while maintaining operational security about the broader pilot program. It wasn't perfect, but it would allow her to function effectively during the upcoming mission. When do I return to Camp Phoenix? Sarah asked. This afternoon. The mission briefing is tonight and you'll deploy with Bravo Company at dawn tomorrow. Mitchell's expression grew serious. Chen, this operation is going to be the real test of everything you've trained for. Multiple units, complex terrain, heavily defended target, and the likelihood of casualties that would challenge even experienced trauma teams. Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of anticipation and responsibility that came with important missions. I understand, sir. Good, there's one more thing. Mitchell handed her an updated identification card. As of today, your official military occupational specialty is listed as combat medic. It's not the whole truth, but it's closer than what you've been carrying. The new ID felt heavier in her hand than the old one, weighted with the responsibility of her revealed capabilities and the expectations that would come with tomorrow's mission. When she returned to Camp Phoenix, she would no longer be the mysterious tent girl who kept to herself. She would be Private Chen, the medic whose skills might mean the difference between life and death for the soldiers of Bravo Company. Sarah returned to Camp Phoenix as the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the compound. The same helicopter that had taken her to meet Colonel Mitchell now brought her back to a unit that viewed her completely differently than when she had left that morning. Word of her updated military classification had preceded her arrival, and she could see soldiers gathering near the landing zone with undisguised curiosity. Corporal Jackson was among the first to approach her as she disembarked. So Chen, or should I say Doc Chen now? He asked with a slight grin. Heard you got some kind of promotion or reassignment today. Something like that, Sarah replied, shouldering her gear and noting how the dynamic had already shifted. The soldiers were no longer looking at her as the mysterious support clerk, but they weren't quite sure how to treat her as a medic either. The transition felt awkward for everyone involved. Captain Morrison intercepted her before she could reach her tent. Chen, mission briefing in 1 hour. You'll be participating as our unit medic for tomorrow's operation. The briefing tent was packed with soldiers from Bravo Company and representatives from the 2 other units that would participate in the assault. Sarah found herself seated in the front row, a position that reflected her new role and the importance of medical support for the upcoming mission. Morrison began with aerial photographs of the target compound, a fortified structure built into a hillside that provided excellent defensive advantages for the occupants. Intelligence indicates that Ahmad Hassan, the bomb maker responsible for at least 15 IED attacks in our sector, is currently at this location along with 6 to 8 fighters. The tactical plan was complex, involving simultaneous assaults from 3 directions to prevent the target from escaping through known tunnel systems. Alpha Company would approach from the north, Charlie Company from the west, while Bravo Company would assault the main entrance from the south. The coordination required precise timing and communication to prevent friendly fire incidents. Expected resistance is significant, Morrison continued. Hassan's fighters are experienced and well-armed. We anticipate they'll use the compound's defensive features to inflict maximum casualties before being overrun. Sarah studied the aerial photos with professional interest, noting potential casualty collection points and evacuation routes. The terrain around the compound was rough and rocky, making traditional medical evacuation challenging. Any wounded personnel would need to be stabilized on-site and carried to pickup zones that were considerable distances from the fighting. Casualties are expected to be heavy, Morrison said, his voice growing more serious. Standard medical evacuation procedures may not be possible during the initial assault phase due to enemy fire and terrain limitations. Private Chen will be our primary medical asset during the operation. The weight of that responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders as she felt the eyes of 30 soldiers focusing on her. They were counting on her skills to keep them alive if things went wrong. Yet most of them still didn't fully understand the extent of her training and capabilities. After the briefing, Sarah spent the evening checking and rechecking her medical supplies. The standard combat medic loadout would be insufficient for the anticipated casualties, so she carefully selected additional equipment from the base medical facility. Trauma bandages, plasma expanders, emergency surgical instruments, and enough morphine to treat multiple severe wounds. Her pack grew heavier with each addition. Private Williams approached her tent as she was organizing supplies by priority and accessibility.
Chen, can I ask you something?
Sure. How long have you been a medic? I mean, really been a medic, not just the support clerk thing. Sarah looked up from her equipment. Long enough to know what I'm doing, Williams. That's what matters tomorrow. Yeah, but yesterday when Rodriguez got hit, you moved like you'd been doing trauma medicine for years. And today everyone's saying you have some kind of advanced training that most medics don't get. The questions were inevitable, and Sarah had prepared answers that would satisfy curiosity without revealing classified information about her assignment. I volunteered for additional medical training before this deployment. The Army has programs for soldiers who show aptitude for advanced trauma care. It wasn't exactly a lie, though it wasn't the complete truth either. Williams seemed satisfied with the explanation. But Sarah could see other soldiers gathering nearby. Drawn by their conversation and their own curiosity about her background, Sergeant Martinez joined the group.
Chen, I want to go over casualty evacuation procedures with you.
If we take multiple wounded during the assault, how do you want to handle triage and treatment priorities? The question demonstrated that Martinez was taking her role seriously and wanted to ensure effective coordination between medical treatment and tactical operations. Sarah appreciated his professional approach and launched into a detailed discussion of trauma protocols, evacuation procedures, and communication requirements. As she explained her methods for assessing and prioritizing multiple casualties, the gathered soldiers began to understand that her medical knowledge went far beyond basic first aid. Her casual references to advanced trauma, techniques, and surgical procedures made it clear that she possessed skills typically found only in hospital emergency rooms or specialized military medical units. Where exactly did you train? Asked Thompson, his curiosity overcoming military courtesy. Because what you're describing sounds like doctor-level stuff. Sarah paused, aware that her technical knowledge was revealing more about her background than she intended. Various military medical facilities. The important thing is that I'm qualified to treat whatever injuries we might encounter tomorrow. Jackson, who had been listening carefully to the entire conversation, exchanged glances with Williams. Both soldiers were beginning to suspect that Sarah's assignment to their unit was more deliberate than the random personnel shuffling they had initially assumed. Chen, Jackson said slowly, you didn't just happen to get assigned to our unit, did you? Someone specifically put you here. Sarah met his gaze steadily. Does it matter? Tomorrow we're going into a fight and you need someone who can patch you up if things go bad. That's what I'm here for. The deflection was skillful but didn't fully satisfy Jackson's suspicions. However, the approaching mission left little time for further speculation. The soldiers gradually dispersed to complete their own preparations, leaving Sarah alone with her medical supplies and her thoughts about the dangerous day ahead. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by mental rehearsals of trauma procedures and worst-case scenarios. Sarah found herself running through complex medical protocols in her mind, preparing for the reality that tomorrow she might be the only thing standing between wounded soldiers and death. The responsibility was enormous, but it was exactly what she had trained for during months of intensive preparation. At 04:30 hours, the camp began stirring as soldiers prepared for the pre-dawn assault. Sarah completed her final equipment checks by flashlight, ensuring that every piece of medical gear was properly secured and easily accessible. Her pack now weighed nearly 60 pounds, loaded with enough supplies to treat multiple severe casualties for extended periods. The helicopter insertion would take them to a landing zone 2 miles from the target compound, allowing them to approach on foot under cover of darkness. Sarah positioned herself in the aircraft where she could monitor all the soldiers during the flight, already beginning her medical assessment before they even reached the combat zone. As the Blackhawks lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah felt the familiar combination of anxiety and anticipation that preceded major operations. In a few hours, she would discover whether months of training and preparation had adequately prepared her for the reality of mass casualty trauma in combat conditions. The soldiers around her were quiet, focused on the mission ahead and the knowledge that some of them might not return to Camp Phoenix that evening. They had placed their trust in her abilities, even though they still didn't fully understand who she was or why she possessed such advanced medical skills. Looking out at the dark landscape passing below, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her role had changed in just a few days. She was no longer the invisible tent girl observing from the margins. Tomorrow would test everything she had learned and determine whether the experimental program that had brought her to Bravo Company was truly worth the risks and deceptions it required. The assault began at exactly 0630 hours with Bravo Company advancing through rocky terrain toward the fortified compound. Sarah moved with the second wave of soldiers, positioned to reach casualties quickly while maintaining enough distance from the initial breach to avoid becoming a casualty herself. The morning air was crisp and clear, providing excellent visibility for both the attacking forces and the defenders. The first sign of resistance came as Alpha Company approached from the north, automatic weapons fire erupting from concealed positions around the compound's perimeter. Within seconds, the coordinated assault became a chaotic firefight, as all three companies encountered heavier opposition than intelligence reports had predicted. Contact north, Alpha Company taking heavy fire, crackled through the radio as Sergeant Martinez coordinated Bravo Company's approach to their assigned breach point. The sound of explosions and gunfire echoed off the surrounding hills, creating a cacophony that made radio communication difficult. Sarah's first casualty came before Bravo Company even reached the compound walls. Private Johnson stepped on a concealed anti-personnel mine that had been missed during the initial reconnaissance. The explosion threw him backward into a cluster of rocks, his right leg mangled below the knee and shrapnel wounds covering his torso. "Medic!" screamed Williams, who had been advancing next to Johnson when the mine detonated. But Sarah was already moving, her training overriding the natural instinct to seek cover from the continuing firefight around them. She reached Johnson within 30 seconds of the explosion, immediately assessing his injuries while bullets cracked overhead. The mine had caused severe trauma to his lower leg, with arterial bleeding that would prove fatal within minutes if not controlled. Sarah applied a tourniquet with practiced efficiency while simultaneously checking for additional wounds. "Johnson, stay with me," she said calmly, establishing an IV line despite the difficult conditions. "You're going to be fine, but I need you to focus on my voice and keep breathing normally." The wounded soldier was conscious but in shock, his face pale and his breathing rapid and shallow. Sarah administered pain medication and began the process of stabilizing him for evacuation, all while the assault continued around them. "Martinez, I need covering fire and 2 soldiers to assist with casualty evacuation," she called out over the radio, her voice carrying the authority she had displayed during the IED incident. Before Martinez could respond, another voice came over the radio. "Doc, we've got multiple casualties at the north wall. Alpha Company needs immediate medical assistance." Sarah found herself facing the nightmare scenario that all combat medics train for but hope, never to encounter multiple casualties in different locations requiring simultaneous treatment. The tactical situation made it impossible to reach all the wounded immediately, forcing her to make rapid decisions about prioritization and resource allocation. "Williams, Thompson, you stay with Johnson and continue pressure on that wound exactly as I showed you," she ordered, handing off supplies while preparing to move to the next casualty site. "Martinez, I'm moving north to assist Alpha Company. Maintain radio contact." The run to Alpha Company's position took her through open ground under sporadic enemy fire. Sarah moved with purpose rather than panic, using available cover while carrying medical supplies that could mean the difference between life and death for the wounded. Soldiers ahead, she found Alpha Company's casualties behind a low stone wall that provided minimal protection from the continuing firefight. 3 soldiers were down, one with a severe chest wound, another with multiple shrapnel injuries, and a third who appeared to have suffered a concussion from an explosion. The soldier with the chest wound was the most critical. Corporal Martinez, not the same Martinez from Bravo Company, had taken a rifle round that had punctured his lung and was causing progressive breathing difficulties. Sarah immediately began treating his tension pneumothorax, using a needle decompression technique to relieve pressure in his chest cavity. "This is going to hurt, but it will help you breathe," she told Martinez as she worked. The procedure was complex and dangerous under normal conditions, but performing it while under enemy fire required extraordinary concentration and steady hands. While treating Martinez's chest wound, Sarah simultaneously directed the treatment of the other casualties, instructing nearby soldiers on proper wound care and pressure application. Her ability to manage multiple patients while performing complex medical procedures amazed the Alpha Company soldiers, who had never seen such advanced trauma care delivered under combat conditions. "Where the hell did she learn to do that?" muttered one of the Alpha Company medics, who had been overwhelmed by the number and severity of casualties before Sarah's arrival. The assault on the compound continued for another 40 minutes, with Bravo and Charlie companies eventually breaching the main defenses and capturing the target building. But the cost had been significant: 7 soldiers wounded, including 2 with life-threatening injuries that required immediate evacuation. Sarah found herself coordinating the medical care for all 7 casualties, moving between positions and ensuring that each wounded soldier received appropriate treatment based on the severity of their injuries. Her medical pack was nearly empty by the time the fighting ended, but all the wounded were stable and ready for helicopter evacuation. As the medevac helicopters arrived to transport the casualties to better medical facilities, the flight medic who had praised Sarah's work after the IED incident approached her with obvious amazement. "Chen, I don't know where you trained or what your background is, but what you did here today was extraordinary," he said, reviewing her treatment notes for each casualty. "You probably saved at least 4 lives through immediate intervention that wouldn't have been available otherwise. The successful treatment of multiple severe casualties under combat conditions had not gone unnoticed by the soldiers of all 3 companies. Word spread quickly through the ranks about the medic from Bravo Company, who had single-handedly managed trauma care for the entire operation. Captain Morrison approached Sarah as she was repacking her remaining medical supplies. "Jen, I've been getting reports from Alpha and Charlie companies about your performance today. Apparently you've made quite an impression." Sarah looked up from her gear, exhausted but satisfied that all the wounded soldiers were alive and stable. "Just doing my job, sir." "This wasn't just doing your job," Morrison replied. "This was the kind of medical performance that saves entire operations. I'm recommending you for commendation, and I suspect Colonel Mitchell will want to speak with you again very soon." As the successful mission concluded, and the companies prepared to return to their respective bases, Sarah realized that her role had fundamentally changed. She was no longer operating under any kind of cover or maintaining the pretense of being anything other than what she truly was: an exceptionally skilled combat medic, whose presence had made the difference between success and disaster. The soldiers who had once called her Tent Girl now looked at her with respect and gratitude. She had proven herself under the most challenging conditions possible, demonstrating that her specialized training and mysterious assignment had served a vital purpose. The experimental program that had brought her to Bravo Company had achieved its ultimate validation through the lives she had saved during the most critical mission any of them had ever undertaken. 3 days after the successful assault on Ahmad Hassan's compound, Colonel Mitchell arrived at Camp Phoenix unannounced. His visit sent ripples of speculation through the base, particularly among the soldiers of Bravo Company, who had witnessed Sarah's extraordinary performance during the mission. Word had spread that their quiet tent girl had been personally credited with saving multiple lives and managing medical care for an entire multi-company operation. Sarah was cleaning her medical equipment when Sergeant Martinez found her outside the aid station that had become her unofficial headquarters since returning from the mission. "Chen, the colonel wants to see you, and this time, he's here instead of calling you to him." The command tent had been rearranged to accommodate the colonel's visit, with additional seating and communications equipment. Captain Morrison stood at attention as Sarah entered, followed by the senior non-commissioned officers from all 3 companies that had participated in the assault. The formal atmosphere suggested this was more than a routine debriefing. "Private Chen," Colonel Mitchell began, "please have a seat. What we're about to discuss involves not just your performance during the recent operation, but the future of a program that could affect how the Army approaches battlefield medicine." Sarah took her seat, aware that the eyes of every senior leader in the room were focused on her. The weight of their attention felt different now than it had during her weeks of anonymity. These were combat veterans who had witnessed her skills firsthand and understood their significance. The assault on Hassan's compound provided conclusive data about the experimental medical support program, Mitchell continued. "Your performance during that operation exceeded all expectations and proved the concept beyond any reasonable doubt." The colonel consulted a folder of reports and medical evaluations. 7 casualties with varying degrees of severity, treated simultaneously under combat conditions by a single medic, with a 100% survival rate. The flight medics, trauma surgeons, and medical officers who reviewed your work all describe it as exceptional. Captain Morrison nodded in agreement. Sir, the soldiers in all 3 companies are calling her a miracle worker. Some of them are saying she saved the entire operation by keeping wounded soldiers in the fight long enough to complete the mission. Mitchell stood and walked to the map wall, pointing to locations marked with red pins. The success of this operation has implications beyond the immediate tactical victory. The intelligence gathered from Hassan's compound has already led to the discovery of 3 major weapons caches and the arrest of 6 bomb makers operating in our sector. Sarah began to understand that her medical intervention had contributed to a much larger intelligence success. By keeping casualties low and maintaining the combat effectiveness of all 3 companies, she had enabled them to capture valuable intelligence that might have been lost if the operation had been compromised by high casualty rates. Private Chen, Mitchell said, turning back to face her directly, I'm authorized to inform you that your experimental assignment has been deemed a complete success. The data collected during your time with Bravo Company will be used to restructure how the Army deploys advanced medical assets in infantry units. The announcement brought a mixture of satisfaction and uncertainty. Sarah had known from the beginning that her assignment was experimental, but she had grown attached to Bravo Company and the soldiers who had become her comrades and patients. What happens next, sir? She asked. Several options, Mitchell replied. First, we could promote you and transfer you to a position training other medics in the advanced techniques you've demonstrated. Your experience would be invaluable in developing new training protocols. The idea of teaching appealed to Sarah, but it would mean leaving field operations and the direct patient care that had drawn her to medicine in the first place. Second, we could assign you to a special operations unit that requires your level of medical expertise on a permanent basis. These units regularly face the kind of complex trauma, situations where your skills would make the most difference. Special operations would provide the kind of challenging medical scenarios that pushed her abilities to their limits, but it would also mean working with unfamiliar personnel and starting over in terms of building trust and relationships. Third, Mitchell continued, we could make your assignment to Bravo Company permanent, with your true qualifications and role fully disclosed. You would serve as their dedicated combat medic with authority and resources appropriate to your training level. This option appealed to Sarah most strongly. She had developed genuine bonds with the soldiers of Bravo Company, and they had proven they could work effectively together under the most challenging conditions. Captain Morrison spoke up. Sir, if I may, the soldiers of Bravo Company have specifically requested that Private Chen remain with our unit. They've seen what she can do, and they trust her completely. Colonel Mitchell smiled slightly. I thought that might be the case, which is why I've brought some additional information to share with everyone present. He opened another folder and pulled out official documents. Private Chen, your performance during the experimental program has earned you an immediate promotion to sergeant and a recommendation for the Army Commendation Medal with V device for Valor Under Fire. The promotion was unexpected but welcome. Sarah had hoped her work would be recognized, but the rapid advancement reflected the significance of what she had accomplished. More importantly, Mitchell continued, the Secretary of the Army has approved the establishment of a new military occupational specialty based on your training and performance. Advanced combat trauma specialists will be embedded in infantry units throughout the Army, providing the kind of immediate, expert medical care that proved so effective during your assignment. The news meant that Sarah's experimental role would become an official part of military organization, potentially saving countless lives through improved battlefield medicine. Sergeant Chen, Mitchell said, using her new rank for the first time, you have the honor of being the first soldier to hold this new specialty. Your experiences and recommendations will shape how the Army trains and deploys advanced medical personnel for years to come. The responsibility was enormous, but Sarah felt ready for it. The weeks with Bravo Company had taught her not just about combat medicine, but about leadership, trust, and the bonds that form between soldiers who depend on each other for survival. Thank you, sir, she replied. I'd like to remain with Bravo Company and continue developing the integration between advanced medical support and infantry operations. Mitchell nodded approvingly. I thought you might say that. Captain Morrison, Sergeant Chen will remain assigned to your unit with expanded authority and resources. She'll also serve as a liaison to help establish similar programs in other infantry units. As the formal meeting concluded, the soldiers of Bravo Company gathered outside the command tent to congratulate their newly promoted medic. The transformation from mysterious tent girl to respected Sergeant Chen was complete, but the bonds formed during those weeks of anonymity remained strong. Corporal Jackson was among the first to approach her. "So, Doc, I guess this means we get to keep you?" Sarah smiled, feeling more comfortable with her role and identity than she had since arriving at Camp Phoenix. "Looks like you're stuck with me, Jackson." "Good," he replied, "because after what you did during that mission, none of us want to go anywhere without our miracle medic." As the sun set over Camp Phoenix that evening, Sarah stood outside the aid station that had become her permanent assignment. The small tent at the edge of the base where she had once hidden her true identity was being converted into additional medical storage space. She no longer needed to conceal her capabilities or maintain the pretense of being something she wasn't. The experiment was over, but the real work was just beginning. Training other medics, refining protocols, and continuing to serve the soldiers who had become her family, all of it lay ahead as challenges she was eager to meet. The quiet, mysterious tent girl had evolved into Sergeant Chen, advanced combat trauma specialist, and the Army's newest weapon in the fight to save lives on the battlefield.